Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. This meeting's pretty quickly followed our last one, so a relatively short agenda. Just a few bits that I need to mention. This meeting is being recorded and streamed live. It's being conducted in accordance with the Council's remote meetings protocol and procedures. Can I please ask that if you would like to speak, please can you raise your virtual hand. Please can we mute microphones when we're not speaking. It's helpful if people can leave their cameras on, but obviously if it's breaking up and you need to turn it off, absolutely fine. This meeting will vote by general assent. And Joanna, can I check that you're happy to confirm the meeting attendance using the list on the screen?
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you very much. So if we go to apologies for absence and substitutes. Derek, are you aware of any apologies or substitutes? Or Joanna?
Yeah, so Stuart Bevan and Debbie Smith.
Okay, and I don't think there's any substitute members this evening. Although for a minute I thought, Tim, you had substituted somebody else in for you. Okay, is Paul Tatum with us this evening? I can't see him on screen, but Paul has taken over from Greg as the trade union representative. Paul, is that right? Are we not expecting him today?
I've not had any communication with him, Stuart. He's been invited to the meeting. I believe he wants to attend, but I guess he's got maybe he's got a conflicting appointment or something. But I'll follow up afterwards. Okay,
thank you very much. And just to make you aware that Angela Fright, who supports Paul as the school's funding officer, has reduced her hours and is now doing a job share with Nicola Fletcher, who was appointed last month. And so Nicola may join the forum going forward. And Karen. Oh, there she is. I understand this is your last meeting.
It was. You called me trying to sort out my technical stuff.
I thought you were running away.
That was what the hand was for. Yes, thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure to serve for the past 9 years. It's never been dull, Paul.
If only it had been.
If only it had been. I think it's going to get a whole lot more exciting. So I wish you all the very best.
And just then, Karen, to note our thanks for your service. 9 years is a good innings on the forum. So thank you very much for everything you've done for us. Okay, I'm just coming to declarations of interest. We don't think there are any particular declarations, but obviously if we're discussing anything and it becomes evident that you do have an interest, please just stick your hand up. That takes us to agenda item number 3, which is matters arising. There are a couple, and Keith, there is one for you. I think at the last meeting, page 6, item 260, it needed a vote from a local authority secondary. We just need to check with you that you are happy with the outcome. Are you aware of this, Keith? Sorry.
Yeah, yes, I am. I'm just raising my hand.
Go for it.
Yeah, there you go. I'll lower my hand.
Keith has voted to support that. Thank you very much.
Can I, before we press on those, Stuart, can I just ask the question? Is this creating a little bit of a difficulty for the forum?
Go on, Paul, you might have to help me.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is obviously we've got one maintained secondary school now. Keith, the representative, says Keith's not available and there's a decision. That should be difficult to make, but there are very few occasions that we need a secondary maintained school specific decision. So it's very rare that it's isolated to that representative member. So there's another one tonight, and there was last night. So there's just a couple of things in the budget really that that affect. So I don't think it'll be a terrible I don't think it's going to be a difficulty very often, but there's just going to be one or two key items. So we might have to think about whether there's a way that we can do that if Keith can't attend. But I think that's, this is the first time it's reared its head. So I think it's one of those things that, it's difficult to predict, but then when it does happen, you can get stumped a bit. So if we go away and think about that. But yeah, as I say, there's another one today. So can I just check then, Keith, are you liable to stay for the rest of the meeting? Can we chain you to that desk? Okay, thank you. All right, thank you. Yeah, so we'll give that some more consideration in the background and see if there is a way that we can work this if you're not available.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Paul.
And apologies for my absence in the last meeting.
There was an action for Nathan to come and update us on SRPs, and that's on the agenda today. I've got an action for Cheryl to send the restructuring document to members of the forum who are not head teachers. I don't know whether that happened. It did.
Yes, I sent it via Derek. So
I got a thumbs up from Roger,
yes,
so it's
yes,
gone out.
yes.
Thank you very much. And then there was an action about for Cheryl and Councillor Barnard to have a look at the distribution of funds from the Ukraine.
So
I
had all the details collated school by school with amounts, and he now has them in a document which he's looking at currently.
So how will we be informed of that?
Well, he said he would look at it.
Okay.
So I'm not sure how he's going to follow it up, but he's got the information. He said he'd be looking at it because there were concerns from schools that some schools had funding, some didn't, and it also was dependent on certain children. So he's going to consider what next steps are, but I haven't got an answer for you today, I'm afraid.
Okay, and I think it was also tied in with a consultation document which had a deadline towards the end of last month, and so I don't think we've had any feedback on that unless others have seen it. But
anything that's gone out would have gone out from the chief exec's office.
Okay.
So I know some paperwork has gone out to schools, but the specific thing was he wanted to look at the fact that some schools receive no funding and that there's limited funding. So it was actually looking at the funding streams to schools. And although it's not school forum business, we did want to follow up, and we have flagged up around
Okay.
this. So I think he may raise it at a higher level.
okay, all right, thank you very much.
But Stuart, take it as an action. I will follow it up with him.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. In that case, are we all happy to accept the minutes as a correct record of our last meeting? Lovely, thank you very much. So that takes us on to item number 4, specialist resource provision. And Nathan, I think this is you taking us through this.
Indeed, yes. Thank you, Chair. I shall keep it relatively brief. I did update verbally to Schools Forum the last session. There hasn't been a huge amount of update, but I'll update what I can. A lot of work's been actually ongoing regarding reviewing the SLCM provision at Meadowvale. I have now met with the head. Obviously, it's a concern when there's 20 places and we're only utilising 3, and it would appear that there are underutilised resources there that could potentially be much more effectively used elsewhere across the system. I have engaged with health and I'm trying to understand what our contractual arrangements are, particularly around the speech and language and speech and language assistant. I have a parent engagement event next week to try and understand from a parental perspective why they aren't choosing to send their children to Meadowvale. And I'm also trying to understand from a SEND service perspective level of consultations that have gone to the school. So it's a kind of triangulated approach very much. I think if we're going to retain the model, we have to utilise that provision much more effectively than we currently are. I think with only 3 children there, it's hard to justify the level of funding that we're currently providing the setting. So that's an ongoing piece of work as I engage more closely with health and my commissioning colleagues and parents to understand exactly what's happening. I am planning a second visit to Meadowvale with Kate Worsley, the designated clinical officer, early in January to meet with the head and to meet with the speech and language therapist based at that site. SLA has now been completed, or the update has, and has been rolled out to all heads and leads of SRPs. So far, the response is very favourable. And while I'm having a small amount of feedback, it is extremely minor with just some small changing in wording. And I'm working with commissioning and finance to make sure that we're all happy, and those will be issued hopefully early in 2023. Key area of that is we've removed that 50% mainstream occupancy, 50% mainstream accessing the curriculum, and that seems to be one of the key elements that has fallen very favourably with colleagues, along with the double occupancy to take into account those children who are, well, 50% mainstream, you know, their seat is kept warm in essence. So that's been removed as well. The work for defining level of need is very much ongoing, and the banding tool will play a key element within the defining of that. The banding tool does set out when children could be accessing mainstream, could be accessing SRP, and could be accessing special school. It's not a definitive steer, it is a guide as much as anything else. So I'm engaging with all schools, looking at really defining their offer. That has created quite a bit of discussion that will require some more ongoing work and unpicking, particularly with certain schools. Other schools, it's a lot more straightforward. There has been a desktop exercise done. There's some really good information out there. So I'm trying to kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Develop a consistency across. So from a parental perspective, it's relatively straightforward for them to be able to compare and contrast, along with school heads across the system as well. And as soon as that's been developed, that will be published on the local offer, so it's available for all. And as part of, as another task is around developing the admission routes. So I have worked on developing a policy around admissions into SRPs and special schools. And within that document, I will also set out exactly all the specialist provision on Bracknell Forest, admission routes, what needs they cater for, so that parents and other professionals can clearly understand the differences between the SRPs across Bracknell Forest. Early years, obviously disappointing that we lost the rainbow provision. I know that Cheryl and Cherry have had some initial discussions about how we can develop that early years provision. I think that there's been other challenges amongst the early years particularly, and we may be able to get a verbal update on that. I'm not sure. I'm in the process of collating all responses regarding SRP's training needs. The list is quite extensive. But there is some parity across different settings. So I will be developing a training program that will be looking at rolling out to all SRPs. And rather than delivering individually, we can develop some sort of economies as multiple different settings access that. Finance, we've done some localized training, and my perception now is that there is a good understanding of the current financial model, but obviously more training will be required when the banding tool is rolled out, as that will have an impact and implications. Interesting through my engagement, particularly with the primary or existing SRPs, there has been some voice that from Birch Hill and Elsmore that they'd like to look at how we could create some additional capacity within their settings. And I think giving the pressure on Kennel Lane, that's probably advisable to explore it. And I can report back on that in the future. I have visits already in the diary for early in 2023. Just to give a quick update on secondary SRPs. So I have sent an email out for an initial request of interests, and 3 schools have put themselves forward. I think we all understand that at this moment in time, that is not a fundamental commitment, and I'm working with those heads. We're doing site visits, and anything that's still outstanding, I will do a site visit early in 2023. January is looking very busy already. Also, what's probably really helpful for colleagues to understand is that I have had an initial meeting with the head at King's Academy Binfield to look at how we can bring those 40 SRP places online. I have had a visit to the site. There will be some capital investment required to make those spaces fit for the task in hand, but it's going to be an ongoing narrative. And I will be visiting again in January in 2023 with Noreen to explore the actual costs of developing that provision. I do have an event diarised with parents in January, and that will be looking at how we can shape up what a parental perspective as their expectations around SRPs, and that will form the basis of our engagement with those schools that have lodged an initial interest. And one other development around secondary is that we are in early discussions with Sandhurst to look at how we can develop a secondary transitional option for children moving out of Ellesmere, given the complexity of that cohort and pressure on our special school places. We already have a position where we have one child that's had to stay on into year 7 due to lack of available places. And I think it's only prudent of us to explore how we can ensure that we have appropriate provision for those children as they move into the secondary stage. Just a quick update now on the banding tool.
Do we just want to take any questions?
Yeah.
Sorry, on that first bit, Nathan.
Of course.
Any queries? Grant, sorry.
Well, firstly, can I commend Nathan on the work he's done, putting the SLAs in place and putting the systems in place. I suppose what I would say is that this is a term too late. This should have been done ready for September when the SRPs opened. Not your fault, Nathan. But I guess my first question is what, given future projects and some bigger than opening SRPs, what's the local authority learned of opening such provision? And what's in place to assure that next time we open provision, actually these sorts of things are in place?
Thanks, Grant. I mean, my view is we need to spend more time at the front end, really. So when schools commit to an SRP, actually there's a real commonality of understanding, and that actually we preempt a number of questions that are going to be asked. I think it's always so much more difficult to do things retrospectively than get them right at the beginning. And I'm running the secondary element a bit more like a formal procurement process with a clear suite of documents that will inform any school and support them to make a fully informed decision. And I think that that's what I've kind of ascertained. I don't think there was a real commonality of understanding from both parties when the previous SRPs were set up. So from my perspective, more time at the beginning, getting it right before we engage more formally.
Has that answered your query, Keith? Sorry. Thank you, Grant. Keith just had a hand up as well. It's gone down. Roger?
Two questions from me. Firstly, how many youngsters entering into primary school or secondary school this year at September are unplaced? Is that a problem still, or has that been resolved?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, Roger, because I don't have full sight of the movements and shifts across the system. Of course, we know that we have real challenges with our special school places. And that's not just Kennel Lane, that's for young people who were autistic and particularly SEMH. So I do think it's likely that that will be challenging. And of course, then SRPs are not going to be the answer for all children. So there is still going to be a deficit of provision, I would have thought. Certainly once we bring if we are successful with our 2 new free schools, that will address a significant area of challenge that we have.
Sorry, Cheryl and Neil are on the call. Do either of, or Neil was on the call, do either of you know the answer to that? How many unplaced students there are?
I'm not aware of any young people where they're unplaced as such. What we have, as we discussed earlier, is young people not in school because the parents are saying that they need to be at home and learning at home. So I think that's masking the problem to some degree. And we're also very aware that there are young people that we've consulted with special schools for, because we believe that's the right setting. And, you know, we've discussed this a few times. The special school are coming back and saying the kids are too complex for them, so they remain in mainstream. So those are my 2 big issues that we're working through, is young people that aren't in a school because the parents are requesting for them to be at home. And I know that SE19 are you know, the 19 local authorities in the southeast, excluding London, had a meeting this morning and was saying it's a problem across all 19 local authorities, this request for EOTAS, and a particular push for EOTAS post-16, which is interesting. So that's my worry, is parents who are saying they want their child to be educated at home on a bespoke curriculum, and young people that are in school but they're in the wrong school. They're the 2 groups we need to focus on.
Keep going, Roger.
Yeah, I'm sorry if this is the wrong forum. I just think it's something we should track and be aware of. It's really important, I think. So I'll move on from there. I haven't had an answer to that question, and I think we should know, and I think we should have a good sense as to why each individual is.
So I'm not aware of any young people that aren't in school where the family are saying, you know, they should be in school. You haven't provided a school. There are parents who think their child's in the wrong school. And I was trying to say that, you know, in that case, we agree with it. And there are parents who are saying their child is on a school roll, but they don't want them to go to school, they're at home. But I'm not aware of a child that's just at home with no school place being offered to them.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Just seconding quickly, it does seem to me that maybe a different model from Meadowvale is a more peripatetic model, might be something worth thinking about, so that the speech and language is able to get out to more schools, because lots of schools are going to need speech and language.
Absolutely.
I just thought I'd throw that in. Thank you.
No, absolutely, Roger. And, you know, I think there are a couple of outcomes of this review, and that is quite a legitimate outcome.
And Nathan, just a question from me. And oh, sorry, Cheryl, is it the same point?
I just wanted to say that was very specific, but there's a bigger piece of work going on, Roger, where the transition and planning for next September for the young people coming into school, and those transitioning from primary to secondary, and those transitioning at post-16 into the next phase. That work is actually well underway. So all children with EHCPs are currently, their caseworkers are working through them and identifying where they go next. So that is the big piece of work that happens. And that is what we're looking for with the SRPs, etc., moving forward. So that has 2 different deadlines. The primaries are due to be completed, I think, mid-February. The secondary post-16 is March.
End of March.
So there are 2 different pieces. There are those children who are not quite in the system that Neil's referenced, and then there's the whole system move as well.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah.
And Nathan, if our objective here is about the improvement of the offer, are we confident about the quality of places and the number of places when we get to next September that these places are going to be there?
You mean as I'm looking at growing them now, or the secondary places?
Both.
I am not confident that all secondary places will be generated for next September. I think that the level of build required on the sites, on some of the sites that I've seen, is quite substantial. and probably more than we envisaged. We may be able to bring some of those on stream in September, but there's a number of factors at play as to which school is successful, what level of funding needs to go in. So it's still a bit uncertain, if I'm honest, Stuart.
Okay, I'm just thinking that even the phased approach, because it might be that, you know, moving year 6 into year 7 to stop them going into the independent sector, or other schools may require a smaller transformation than perhaps the completion of an SRP. But
absolutely,
you're on the case.
Yeah, no, I'm very aware of that, you know, I think there's a lot of ambition for these places to be available, or at least some to be available in September, and we would always staircase the growth because we don't wish to destabilize anywhere. I think we'll have a much clearer view early in January.
Okay, all right, thank you. Is there any other questions on SRPs? In that case, do you want to go on to the banding tool? Sorry, Nathan.
Yeah, of course, thank you. So we had an event, I can't remember the date now, was it the 18th, Liz? Something like that. So we had an event that Liz hosted, and a lot of the organisation was done by Liz and Jenny, so that's greatly appreciated. We had, I think, a reasonably good turnout. I think we probably had about 15 schools there, maybe. So we ran through the banding tool, and we collated some responses, some initial gut thinking, I think, from colleagues that maybe had seen it for the first time. I have attached those comments to the my paper, so it's embedded in the bottom of the document, so please feel free to have a read. I'm now trying to secure all responses from Senkos and heads. Following that exercise, I have about 5 back at the moment. What has been interesting is that schools that weren't able to attend, they're also interested in being part of that process. So I've sent the excellent slide deck that Jenny developed out to those heads and Senkos. One of the things I'm also keen to do is to capture as many children currently accessing our SRPs as well, because I think that that's quite a critical element from my perspective, just to ascertain whether we are funding those children at the right level, and to also run them through the system to understand what the tool says as far as what is the best place for them to be going to. I have some worries about that, but let's wait and see what comes out following that piece of work. I will be sending out a reminder to all participants to get their documents back to me. Cut-off is next Friday, although I'm not going to be so belligerent that anything that comes after that I won't accept. But there will be a point that we have to cut off because we need to do the work and start modelling. Liz and I have had a number of email exchanges, and she's been really supportive and mentioned it at Head's briefing last week. So that just really gives you an update. The critical piece of work will be the next phase, when we model those children through the system and we can really start to understand what the impact will be against the Heineken block budget and what sort of mitigations and changes we have to make to ensure it's affordable. You know, that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you, Nathan. Any questions on the banding? In that case, thank you very much, Nathan. I think that report was just for our information, so no actions for forum on that. Thank you. So that brings us on to item number 5, which is the proposals for the early years budget. Is this you, Cherry?
It's me, Stuart. Yes.
Hello there. Sorry, I was looking for you.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Good evening, everybody. It's always that difficult time of year when we need to have agreement on the principles behind our early years formula, but as yet we don't have a settlement. So in January there will be another paper coming forward with the budgets outlined and the indicative amounts. So really tonight is just about hopefully you agreeing the principles behind the formula. This has already been through our early years forum, and I know Liz and Sue have both been in those meetings as well. So what we're proposing is that we don't make any changes to the formula for the next financial year for 23-24, and that we the budget proposals, should we receive an increase in funding, which we're ever hopeful that we might, that any additional money would go into the base rate. So as in accordance with the statutory guidance, 95% of our settlement goes out to providers and through the formula. And we're not making any changes to what that looks like. So the items that are covered in the formula will continue the same. If we get an increase, as I've said, it will be allocated in the base rate, and then 5% of the total income will be managed centrally by the council to enable us to administer the formula to our providers. The other part of it we get is the Disability Access Fund and Early Years Pupil Premium, and that will be allocated out to providers at the same funding rate that we receive. So that, unless anybody's got any real questions, it's quite an easy paper this evening. I don't know if Liz or Sue from the forum have got any sort of comments from what we discussed a few weeks ago.
I think you've covered everything, Cherry, and I would totally agree with what's being proposed.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments?
It's so very, very vital to get this early help in. So thank you, Cherry, for making it so easy for us to support your decisions from my point of view in that group. And I know Susie feels the same.
I say it's just, I know that David, who prepares all the budget papers, as you know, is currently working on 2 versions for January, one with and one without increases. So we're hopeful that it's the increase one that comes to forum in January.
Yeah, good. Are there any other comments? If not, we're on page 13. We are being asked to agree to 2.1, 2.2 and 2.3. Are there any objections to those? Are there any objections? Okay, so they are agreed. And then to note 2.4, which is, yes, we'll hopefully have some good news in January. So that has been noted.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. On to agenda item number 6. Paul, we're coming to you for this, are we?
Yes, please, Stuart. Thank you very much. Yeah, good evening, everybody. Yeah, so this is just an update paper with a few decisions we're asking you to take during the 23-24 budget setting process. And just to pick up what we talked about in the minutes, there are a couple of specific recommendations in this paper that are only relevant to the primary maintained school representatives and the secondary maintained school representatives, and hopefully they're clearly set out in the recommendations. So hopefully that'll be obvious as we come to those at the end of this discussion on this paper. So just to reiterate, this is taking us on to the next stage of setting next year's budget for schools and also the central schools services block. And we have to get that done and approved by the 20th of January to meet the DfE statutory deadline. Most of the final decisions of the budget, I think everyone knows, are taken by the executive member. The executive member has always taken those decisions based on recommendations from the schools forum. So it is an important part of that consultation process. The other part that this paper also highlights is it's recommending a change to our current funding policy for significant in-year growth. So this is where a school has a big increase in pupil numbers between each academic year start. And that's necessary because now we have a couple of schools that are moving off, the new schools that were built in North Bracknell recently that are moving off the specific new school funding formula and onto the main Bracknell Forest funding formula because they've reached the stage where the scheme says they need to do that. There's some outcomes that we're recognising now that will impact on that current funding policy that we need to review to make sure that all schools are treated fairly and consistently, and that the basis of the policy should be to meet the costs of arising at schools and not necessarily just crossing a threshold, because there's some unique circumstances on those particular schools which are set out in the paper. But I can cover those off in more detail if anyone has any questions later on that one. So that's the key part of this paper. And I think that all I would go do is quickly highlight through the executive summary, which is right at the start of the page, paper on page 19. So basically what we have an update on some of the financial positions, and that's mainly because we've had an opportunity for our own collection of the October 22 census data, which drives next year's budgets. So we're still waiting for the DfE to confirm those numbers, but we have obviously quite a good idea of what that is from the communications we have with our own schools. The key parts that we are still missing is the pupil profile data. So this is an important part of some of the sort of the supplementary funding schools get. So eligibility to free school meals, some of the EAL data, test results, that sort of stuff. We don't have that accurately today. So that's something that's going to change when we come back in January with the final set of budget proposals. But we're not expecting to get that data until the 16th of December. But we are in a position now to give quite a good update on the bulk of the budget. And what that census shows is that we have actually had we've had a much larger increase in pupil numbers this year than we have in previous years. It's gone up over, it's 2.1% this year. In each of the last 3 years, it's ranged between 0.8% and 0.9%. So obviously that then generates extra income to the council's DSG settlement, and it also obviously follows through that those schools with the increase in pupil numbers will receive a financial benefit as well, because the funding comes out on pupil numbers. So in terms of the actual proposals, that they haven't really changed. We haven't got anything new in there, and we highlighted last time that the really big change that's happening in our budget next year is the way that the funding system will operate for those new schools in North Bracknell, for 2 of them, Oakwood and King's Academy Binfield Secondary, where they are getting to the stage where they have their numbers on order approaching their pan, so they're at an economic level that they can transfer to the Bracknell Forest funding formula, so they won't be receiving any diseconomy top-up funding going forward. The only thing I would emphasise at this point in time is that Oakwood is on the cusp of being on the Bracknell Forest funding formula. When we get the data in December, it may well be that it goes back on to requiring some top-up funding. So we don't know that for sure, but it's looking like it will be on the main formula moving forward. And as a consequence of that, there's over £600,000 worth of saving on the budget allocation next year. So all the budget proposals are again in table 1 in the paper, so I won't go through those. This is the significant one that's that is going to benefit the budget allocation next year. And taking account of all the data we have at the moment, what we do see is that it looks like that we will have enough money in the budget to allocate funding to schools at the amounts that the DfE included in our settlement. I say in the past we've had difficulties with that, with the new cost of the new schools, etc. So at this stage, obviously provisional data, we're £46,000 surplus on that. But what I do want to do is, and that's the 2% increase in per pupil funding that is in line with the national average. But what I do want to make clear, and I'm sure it is clear to everyone, that although that we're in a position that we can fund at the level, it looks like we can fund at the level the DfE have put into the budget, that doesn't mean to say obviously all the cost pressures are being funded. That's a completely different question. So I'll pick that up again in a moment, which is covered in the paper. But just to be clear, it looks like we're in a position to pass on the funding that the DfE have allocated at the same value that has been allocated. It's a question of how close that is to the actual costs that are going to occur next year. So obviously in that position, it goes without saying we don't normally have a budget surplus to be looking at. So obviously we're in a really good position in that respect, and we're not alone in that either. There's a number of other authorities that are facing this budget scenario, and there have been some initial discussions with the DfE as to how is the best way to manage this, because it's not something that's really occurred in the past. And there are basically 2 options. You either put that surplus money into a reserve to use in a future year if you have a more difficult financial settlement, or you can up the rates above those that the DfE fund the local authority at. And the advice at the moment from the DfE is you should put that money into reserves, because if you put that money into the rates that we pay next year, there is this requirement on each year to pay a minimum increase year on year. So we can afford that 1 year, and that's because there's this big change in the diseconomy funding. If we're back in a position next year where we don't have any flexibility to meet that meet the full DfE rates, we'll be committed to paying a higher rate than we can afford, and then that will create us some problems. So we need to see how that runs through and what our actual budget position is come once we've run through the calculations for the next meeting. But that's the advice the DfE are giving at the moment. So we'll continue some dialogue with the DfE on about that to see if there's if there's any other options or what they would really suggest. And obviously that's something we'll need to come back to you and talk about at the next meeting. But that's the two options at the moment. So as I say, we've not been in this position before. So again, it's one of those things that we need to spend a bit of time on. But I wanted to highlight it now so that you have a chance to think about how you may want to take that forward in January. But as I say, we should have some updated advice from the DfE at that stage as well. I also want to pick up on the budget statement. So when this paper was reported, all we knew was that there's an extra £2.3 billion going into schools through the autumn funding statement. There have been some clarifications on that. It's on a like-for-like basis, it's £2 billion because you need to remove the saving that's coming through on the national insurance review this year. So it's a £2 billion increase that's being quoted in the press now. It was originally 2.3, but that's the reason for the change. But what did happen on the 6th of November, so December, a couple of days ago, the DfE did release a press release and they confirmed that there will be an extra £500 million capital funding for energy efficiency upgrades in this financial year. And that would be paid at £10,000 per school plus £20 per weighted pupil. So it's roughly equivalent to about double what you got on your initial allocation. So that's just a rough guide, but that's what I'd suggest you just look at that for now. So again, we'll wait for the data from and there are indicative allocations by schools as well. So you can see those on the website, and we've sent some information out on that. So that was something we weren't expecting from that autumn statement, but there's been a slight clarification or a slight moving on in terms of the extra £2 billion that's coming into schools. £400 million of that is to be allocated to local authorities for high needs funding. So that'll ensure that special schools will get a similar sort of additional top up to their funding that other schools will get through the remaining £1.6 billion. And all we've been told is that that's a new grant, but we haven't decided what the grant rates or the methodology to distribute that is right now, but we'll tell you before Christmas. But again, informally, the DfE is saying it's likely to be very similar to the school supplementary grant that you got this year, which comes to you as an amount per pupil, an amount per every 6 free school meal pupil, and a lump sum per school. So our suggestion at this point in time is expect to get something similar to what you got this year in the school supplementary grant, assuming you've got the same pupil numbers. Okay, so it would flex according to whether those have changed. So we won't find that out until, I guess, right at the end of term. But that's not unusual in these things, to be quite honest. So yeah, so that's on the funding update. And the other thing is, just want to come back to this the increase in funding for schools and the cost pressure. So it goes without saying that accurately estimating the cost changes next year is pretty much an impossible task to do. We don't know what pay awards will be for some sectors. There's huge volatility in general price of commodities and services, and obviously utilities is the prime example of that one. So we have done some modelling, and that's included in the paper. And based on those estimated assumptions, which I'm saying right now, it could be very different. The reality could be very different to that. But what we think is a reasonable calculation is that the cost will go up between 6 and 7% next year. But it looks like the funding will probably go up between 5.5%. So there does look like there'll be a funding gap next year, and obviously we're not going to know what that gap really is until next year comes to an end anyway, in terms of what's actually happening in prices. So and that's a message we're getting from our other local authority colleagues as well. Although there's more money in the system, it's not going to cover we don't think it will cover cost increases. So obviously that's a concern to everyone. But I think that the amount of funding that we've been notified now, I think that's going to be the funding that's available, and obviously that's schools are obviously going to recognise that and look to make their plans accordingly. But that's the advice we're giving at the moment. But obviously you'll realise that the cost pressures are just very, 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 very volatile at the moment and difficult to predict. So I mean that's the update we are on the budget, I think. And all I'd say is that we'll be coming back in January as usual with the final set of proposals. We'll have all the data and we should have all the calculations available for that. And then we'll need to make those final decisions, which will then go on to final recommendations, which will go on to the executive member. And that decision is due to be taken on the 17th of January. So that's shortly after the schools forum and just before the deadline for the DFE. So yeah, that's what I'd like to present on this paper. So over to you if there's any questions then, please.
Well, I've just got one on that last point, and I think it's just worth us noting that Forum has been grumpy about budget deadlines and having figures at the last minute and then not really able to make any change because of timescales. But we are as advanced as we can be with the information that's being provided, aren't we? That there's
exactly,
there's
yeah, definitely. We can't finalise them until we get the information from the DFE, and we're not expecting to get that before the 16th of December.
Okay, so yeah, just to point that out to forum members. Sorry, Grant.
Actually, just two things. One, just the pedant in me just wonders if we should still be referring to King's Academy Binfield as the Binfield Learning Village, since it's been King's Academy Binfield for quite a while now. So that's just a pedant in me, and that we ought to call it by its proper name. The second bit was about the Annex 1, which I've got no general concern with. I'm in favour of it. I just wondered actually in terms of scenarios about caveats, is that it occurs to me just looking at the pupil numbers in reception, that actually across North and South Bracknell there was probably less or fewer spare places than I think we were anticipating, slightly more in Crowthorne and Sandhurst. So if that pressure continues, the assumption in some of the caveats are that it's schools who are currently one form expanding to two, and it's the first time they've been to, or there's a surge class. But isn't a potential scenario, actually that a formerly two-form entry school that used to that has gone down to one goes back to two, which is almost the opposite of the caveat in point 2. So I just wonder whether we ought to think about that as what nation of that is. I don't know what it is, because Paul, it's your department and you're probably on this completely, as I know you are, but it just occurred to me that actually we were thinking that places we're going to have massive overcapacity, and actually it turned out in North and South Bracknell there wasn't massive overcapacity in reception. I think there was about 30 places, if I remember rightly, across those two areas. I think it was twice that in Sandhurst and Crowthorne. But actually we could be in a position where there is place pressure asking schools that shrank to grow. How do they get extra funding if they need to do that, and how does that work? I just think we ought to be aware of that just in case.
Yeah, again, I mean, obviously we are doing some forward looking on those sort of things. There's nothing of that nature in the pipeline at the moment, so we haven't got to the stage where we foresee an immediate difficulty with that. But it's like a lot of these things. You generally pick them up at the start of a financial year, so you have an opportunity to do those changes. So like this one here, if Oakwood becomes on the Bracknell Forest funding formula, it'll have an increase of over 30 pupils. So it would trigger 3 funding thresholds on our current formula, but in reality, they're just opening 1 extra class. So the point of that is obviously to make sure everyone gets the funding they need to meet the costs, and everyone's treated on a consistent and fair basis. But you couldn't, we didn't envisage that when the policy was originally set up. But as these things change, we do normally have a window to pick those changes up. And we always approach these on the basis that we want to pass on funds to schools in comparison to what their costs are. So we always have to have that in the back of our minds when we do this. And as you say, there will undoubtedly be other scenarios as well at different stages. But yeah, we keep an eye on that, and I understand what you're saying there, but we're not aware of anything likely to happen next year on that basis. And we should have some lead-in time if that was the case as well. Thank you.
Any other questions? Roger, you did have a hand up. Was that the same thing? Okay. Any more for Paul? In that case, can we go to page 20? So for all members, these are the significant ones that subject to late changes. We are agreeing that the budget is set in accordance with the information. So are we all in agreement with 3.1? and then 3.2, which is what we've just been discussing. Is there any disagreement with those? Okay, so 3.1 and 3.2 are agreed. 3.3 is to note the options available, so they are duly noted. 3.4 is for our maintained primary representatives. So do any of our maintained primary representatives disagree with 3.4? There's no disagreement, so that is agreed. And then to our maintained secondary representative, do you agree with 3.5? Keith's got his hand up. He's agreed. Okay, so 3.5 agreed. Are there any items of other business? There's some firm shakes of the head there. In that case, the next meeting is the 12th of January. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much,
See you
everyone.
next time. Happy Christmas.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Bye.